Over the past few weeks, I played around 80 shoot 'em ups to try to understand a genre I had barely explored. This started as a simple curiosity. Growing up, I enjoyed shooters on consoles, but I never really explored the arcade side of the genre. So I wanted to see what I had been missing. But the deeper I went, the more interesting things became. Patterns started to appear, different design philosophies, different developer schools, and eventually I realized something else. I was also discovering what kind of shmup player I actually am. And maybe the biggest surprise of all, the genre didn't disappear after the arcade era. In many ways, shoot 'em ups might be experiencing a second golden age right now. So after playing 80 games, here are the biggest things I discovered. The reason I started this little investigation was actually pretty simple. I wanted to find the best shoot 'em ups for me. The first big thing I discovered is that shoot 'em ups aren't just one type of game. After playing enough of them, I started to notice that most shooters fall into very different design philosophies. The first group of games focuses on stage memorization and positioning. These shooters tend to have slower pacing, tighter spaces, and enemy waves that spawn in very specific patterns. The challenge comes from learning the stage, where enemies appear, how to position yourself, and how to survive very precise situations. A good example of this style is games like R-Type or Truxton. These games often punish mistakes very heavily, and success usually comes from memorizing the level and executing the correct route. The second design philosophy feels very different. Instead of forcing the player to memorize the stage, these games focus on reading bullet patterns in real time. The screen fills with projectiles, and the challenge becomes finding the safe paths through the chaos. These shooters also tend to give the player much more firepower, which makes the action feel faster and more aggressive. Games like Dodonpachi, Mushihime-sama, or Strikers 1945-2 are great examples of this approach. And that's when I realized something else was happening during this investigation. I wasn't just learning about the genre, I was also discovering what kind of shoot 'em up player I actually am. Before doing this, I could tell when I liked a game or when I didn't, but I didn't really understand why. After playing so many shooters, the pattern became clear. The games that I enjoyed the most were usually the ones focused on bullet patterns and aggressive gameplay. Titles like Dodonpachi, Battle Garega, Strikers 1945-2, or Gigawing. These games tend to give the player a lot of firepower and throw huge bullet patterns at you. Instead of memorizing an entire stage, you are constantly reacting and weaving through the chaos. That style of gameplay just clicked with me immediately. On the other hand, the shooters that rely heavily on strict route memorization, especially the ones in the R-Type lineage, were much harder for me to enjoy. They are clearly great games, but they demand a kind of precision and memorization that doesn't fit with the way I like to play shooters. And once I understood the difference, the genre suddenly became much easier to navigate. I could finally look at a new shooter and have a pretty good idea whether it would be my kind of game or not. As I kept exploring the genre, I started noticing something else that helped everything make sense. These design philosophies didn't just appear randomly. Many of them were shaped by the specific developers, each with their own approach to designing shooters. For example, One of the most influential studios in the genre is Cave. Their games are famous for turning bullet patterns into something almost choreographed, dense curtains of projectiles that the player has to weave through with precise movement. Games like Dodonpachi or Mushihime-sama really showcase that style. Then you have developers like Saikyo, whose shooters feel much faster and much aggressive. Their games often rely on very quick enemy attacks and aim shots that force the player to react instantly. Titles like Strikers 1945 2 are a great example of that high speed style. And then there are studios like Rising, whose games added another layer entirely, with complex scoring systems and deeper mechanics. Games like Armed Police Path Rider and Daimaho are almost as much about mastering its systems as it is about simply surviving the stage. Once I started recognizing these developer schools, the genre became much easier to understand. Even within the same broad philosophy, each studio had its own personality, its own way of creating challenge and spectacle. But the final discovery from this investigation was probably the biggest surprise of all. When I started this project, I assumed that most of the great shoot 'em ups were already behind us, part of the arcade golden age of the 80s and 90s. I expected that the modern era would mostly be about collections and bundles of classic arcade games being re-released for newer systems. You know, compilations of the old hits from studios like Cave, Toplan, or Rising, modernized and packaged for modern platforms. And to be fair, I had already heard about a couple of modern shooters like Crimson Clover World Explosion or Eartheon, so I assumed those were the rare standout exceptions. But once I actually started exploring the modern indie scene, something unexpected happened. I didn't have to dig very deep at all. Almost immediately, I started encountering great shooters one after another. Games like Danmaku Unlimited 3, Devil's Engine, or Devil Blade Reboot. And what surprised me even more was how consistently good these games were. During the investigation, I played dozens of classic arcade shooters, and only a handful really stood out to me as personal favorite. Like I called S tier games. Like even then, inside the same philosophy of games I liked, I tried like 13 games, and only 10 would make the S tier of games for me. When I started exploring modern shmups, it felt like almost every new title I tried was excellent. Instead of just a few highlights surrounded by nostalgia, I found a growing ecosystem of developers who clearly understand the traditions of the genre and are pushing them forward. And the more I looked, the more it felt like this wasn't just a small revival. In many ways, we might actually be living through a second golden age of shoot 'em ups right now. The genre may not dominate arcades anymore, but for players who know where to look, there is an incredible library of modern shooters. And it feels like there is still many more waiting to be discovered. After playing around 80 shoot 'em ups for this little investigation, the genre feels very different to me now. What started as a simple attempt to find a few good games turned into something much more interesting. I began to see the patterns behind the genre, the different design philosophies, the developer schools, and the traditions that shaped these games over the decades. But maybe the most valuable discovery was something much simpler. I finally understood what kind of shoot 'em up player I am. And once you understand that, The genre stops feeling like an endless list of random titles and starts to feel like a landscape you can actually navigate. At the same time, this investigation completely changed the way I see the modern state of the genre. Instead of a relic of the arcade era, shoot 'em ups feel more alive than ever, with a growing number of developers continuing to push the genre forward. And if the last decade is any indication, the future of the genre looks pretty exciting.